It was supposed to be a routine flight, another day in the skies for Michelle, a seasoned flight attendant. She'd been in the airline industry for over a decade, priding herself on her ability to manage passengers with poise and authority. But today, something was different. The flight was buzzing with a sense of quiet excitement as passengers boarded. Whispers rippled through the rows as they caught sight of a well-dressed man stepping onto the plane. He carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, his tailored suit and polished demeanor turning heads. It wasn't long before someone recognized him. "That's Samuel Bryant," a woman murmured to her seatmate. "You know, the tech billionaire. The guy who donated all that money to rebuild schools last year." Michelle noticed the murmurs but paid them little attention. She was more focused on maintaining order and ensuring every passenger followed her rules. From the corner of her eye, she watched Samuel place his briefcase in the overhead compartment. Something about him bothered her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Perhaps it was the way he looked her in the eye when he greeted her, a steady, assured gaze that made her feel as though she wasn't in control. As passengers settled into their seats, Michelle walked down the aisle, checking the overhead bins. Her sharp gaze swept over Samuel's row, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She paused. "Sir," she said in a clipped tone, "your briefcase is too large for the overhead compartment. You'll need to check it." Samuel looked up, surprised. "Oh, I fly often, and this case always fits. But if it's an issue, I'm happy to adjust it," he replied politely, already standing to reposition the case. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Rules are rules," she said, her voice colder now. "You'll have to check it." Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was palpable, but Samuel remained calm. "I completely understand," he said, smiling graciously. "Let me step aside so others can board." Despite his cooperative demeanor, Michelle's irritation seemed to grow. She couldn't explain it, but something about him rubbed her the wrong way. And the fact that he was drawing so much attention didn't help matters. It felt like he was trying to steal the spotlight in her domain. The plane was nearly full when Samuel finally took his seat in first class, greeting his neighbors warmly. The whispers about him continued, passengers marveling at his success, his philanthropy, and his down-to-earth personality. But Michelle couldn't shake her annoyance. To her, he seemed too comfortable, too entitled, and the way other passengers treated him, with deference and admiration, only fueled her resentment. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Michelle made one last pass through the cabin. She stopped at Samuel's seat again. "Sir, I notice you're using noise-canceling headphones," she said with a hint of sarcasm. "You'll need to remove them during takeoff." Samuel looked puzzled. "Of course," he replied, slipping them off and tucking them into his bag. He didn't question her tone or the peculiar scrutiny she seemed to have for him. Instead, he chose to rise above it, flashing her a calm smile. "Thank you for letting me know." But it wasn't enough for Michelle. She found herself scanning for more reasons to challenge him. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign turned off, she approached him yet again. This time, she claimed he was disrupting other passengers by speaking too loudly on a phone call. Though several nearby passengers exchanged confused glances, they hadn't heard a thing. "I'm sorry if I've disturbed anyone," Samuel said sincerely, ending his call immediately. Still, Michelle wasn't satisfied. Her voice grew sharper, her demeanor more confrontational. Samuel remained composed, but passengers were beginning to take notice. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to quiet protests. "What's her problem?" someone muttered under their breath. Moments later, the tension reached its breaking point. Michelle's voice rang out across the cabin, louder than she likely intended. "That's it. I'm going to have to ask you to leave this flight." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. All eyes turned to Samuel, who remained seated, his face a mask of calm disbelief. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Have I done something wrong?" "You've been disruptive since the moment you boarded," Michelle snapped, her voice trembling slightly. "I have the authority to make this decision," and I'm exercising it." Passengers began to murmur in protest. A man in the next row leaned forward. "He hasn't done anything," he said firmly. "You're the one making a scene." Michelle ignored him, calling for security to escort Samuel off the plane. Samuel stood slowly, gathering his belongings. He turned to the passengers around him and offered a soft smile. "I apologize for any inconvenience." As he walked down the aisle, a wave of unease rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Michelle stood tall, her expression resolute, but a faint flush of uncertainty colored her cheeks. Little did she know, her actions had set something much larger into motion, something she couldn't control. 20 minutes later, as the plane remained grounded and the whispers grew louder, Michelle would receive a call from the airline's corporate office, and the news waiting on the other end would shake her to her core. The murmurs among the passengers hadn't died down even after Samuel had been escorted off the plane. Michelle busied herself with routine tasks, trying to ignore the uneasy energy that lingered in the cabin. She felt justified in her actions. Rules were rules, and she had enforced them. Still, there was a faint knot in her stomach that she couldn't quite untangle. Passengers had clearly been on Samuel's side, and that bothered her. Were they questioning her authority? Outside, Samuel stood on the tarmac, speaking calmly with airport staff. His tailored suit remained immaculate despite the wind tugging at his jacket. There was no anger in his demeanor, no raised voice or sharp words. He simply explained the situation, his tone measured and polite. As he spoke, a few of the ground crew exchanged glances. They knew who he was now. His face had been all over the news recently. Samuel Bryant, the tech visionary who had revolutionized education through his innovative apps and had donated millions to underserved communities. He wasn't just wealthy, he was respected. Back on the plane, Michelle received word that they would have to delay takeoff for a few more minutes. She clicked her pen against her clipboard, annoyed. Typical, she muttered under her breath, though even she wasn't sure what she meant by that. Her annoyance with Samuel lingered, and now the delay felt like another inconvenience caused by him. She walked down the aisle again, checking on passengers, ignoring the occasional disapproving glare. But the murmurs wouldn't stop. Why did she do that? A young woman whispered to her seatmate. "I was right behind him in line. He was so polite." It didn't make sense, a man in a baseball cap said, shaking his head. She had it out for him from the start. Michelle caught snippets of their conversation but didn't respond. Instead, she forced a polite smile and continued walking. Her confidence in her decision started to waver, but she pushed the doubt away. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself. Being a flight attendant required authority, and once she made a call, she had to stick to it. Outside, Samuel finished his conversation with the ground crew and made his way back toward the terminal. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he answered it without hesitation. "Hello, this is Samuel," he said, his voice steady despite the surreal situation he'd just experienced. On the other end of the line was his personal assistant, Elena. "Mr. Bryant, I just got word about what happened. Are you all right?" Samuel chuckled softly. "I'm fine, Elena. It's just a bump in the road. These things happen." Elena hesitated. "Well, news travels fast. Someone on the plane posted a video, and it's already circulating online. People are shocked. They're saying you were unfairly removed." Samuel sighed, glancing back at the plane in the distance. "It's not worth dwelling on. Let's focus on the meeting tomorrow. Can you reschedule my flight?" Elena's voice grew more serious. "Mr. Bryant, I don't think this is something to brush off. People are upset. This could escalate." Samuel paused, considering her words. He wasn't on to make a fuss, but he also knew the importance of standing up against injustice. "Let's wait and see," he said finally. "For now, just make the arrangements." As Samuel walked back into the terminal, he noticed a group of passengers disembarking from the plane. Confused, he checked the departure board and saw that the flight was still delayed. Something wasn't adding up. Inside the plane, Michelle's anxiety grew as she answered a call from her supervisor. She stepped into the galley, keeping her voice low. "This is Michelle." The voice on the other end was stern. "Michelle, we need to talk. We've received multiple complaints about how you handled the situation with Mr. Bryant." Michelle's grip on the phone tightened. "Complaints? He was being disruptive." "Disruptive how?" the supervisor asked sharply. "Passengers are saying he was nothing but polite. And do you know who he is?" Michelle bristled. "It shouldn't matter who he is. He wasn't following instructions." "Michelle," the supervisor interrupted, "this isn't just any passenger. Samuel Bryant is a high-profile figure, and the airline can't afford negative press. Videos of the incident are already going viral. We've got people tagging us on social media." Michelle's heart sank. "Discrimination? That's ridiculous. I was just doing my job." "I need you to understand the gravity of this situation," the supervisor said. "Corporate is involved now. You might have to explain yourself directly to the executives." As the call ended, Michelle leaned against the counter, her mind racing. This wasn't how she expected her day to go. She had made a decision, and now it felt like the entire world was scrutinizing her for it. Meanwhile, the passengers who had disembarked were buzzing with their own conversations. One woman, who had been seated near Samuel, was on a video call with her sister. "I couldn't stay on that flight," she said angrily. "The way they treated him was disgusting. He didn't do anything wrong." Another passenger, an older man in a suit, was on the phone with a reporter he knew. "I don't usually get involved in these things," he said, "but what I witnessed today was unacceptable. They kicked off a man who was nothing but respectful." As the situation spiraled, Samuel sat quietly in the terminal, sipping a cup of coffee. He noticed the glances from other travelers, some curious, some sympathetic. A young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Bryant?" Samuel looked up and smiled. "Yes." "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened," the young man said. "I was on that flight, and it wasn't right." Samuel nodded, his smile warm but tinged with sadness. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." The young man hesitated, then added, "People are talking about it online. It's blowing up. You should check your phone." Samuel pulled out his phone and opened his social media apps. His name was trending. Videos of the incident had been shared thousands of times, with captions like "Billionaire treated unfairly" and "When will this stop?" Comments poured in, most expressing outrage on his behalf. Samuel scrolled through the posts, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't one to court controversy, but this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, the way people in positions of authority treated others, especially when biases came into play. Back on the plane, Michelle tried to compose herself. The cabin was unusually quiet, and she could feel the weight of the passengers' judgment. She replayed the incident in her mind, trying to convince herself that she had done the right thing. But the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. As the minutes ticked by, she received another call from her supervisor. This time, the message was clear. The flight couldn't proceed until they addressed the situation. The airline was sending someone to mediate. Michelle felt the walls closing in. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to handle any situation. But now it seemed like the very foundation of her career was being called into question. Outside, Samuel remained calm as an airline representative approached him. The woman looked flustered but professional as she introduced herself. "Mr. Bryant, I'm so sorry for what happened. We'd like to invite you back onto the flight." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And the flight attendant who asked me to leave?" The representative hesitated. "We're handling the situation internally. Please know this doesn't reflect our company's values." Samuel considered her words, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't just about getting back on the plane, it was about making a statement. But for now, he remained silent, letting the tension build as he weighed his next move. Samuel looked at the airline representative carefully. There was no hostility in his expression, only a quiet thoughtfulness. After a long pause, he spoke. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure that's the right solution. This isn't about me getting back on the plane. It's about addressing what happened." The representative's polite smile faltered slightly, replaced by a nervous edge. She had likely been sent to smooth things over, to patch up a public relations mess before it spiraled further. "Mr. Bryant," she began, her voice lower now, "we truly regret the misunderstanding. The situation is under review, and I assure you that our airline does not tolerate discrimination in any form." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "Misunderstanding? I'm not sure I follow. The flight attendant made a decision, and now it's being reconsidered because of public attention. What exactly is the misunderstanding here?" The woman hesitated, her professional demeanor cracking just enough to reveal her discomfort. "We're committed to ensuring all our passengers are treated fairly," she said finally. "If you prefer to continue this conversation in private." Samuel held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need," he said calmly. "I think the passengers who were there already know the truth. I'd prefer any discussion about this to be as transparent as possible." Inside the plane, the passengers were growing restless. Many had taken out their phones, refreshing social media feeds to see if there were updates on the incident. Others whispered to one another, speculating about what would happen next. The tension was almost tangible, filling the cabin like a thick fog. One passenger, a middle-aged woman named Carla, leaned over to the man seated next to her. "I was watching him the whole time," she said in a hushed voice. "He didn't do a thing. That flight attendant just kept picking on him for no reason." The man nodded. "I thought so too. It's hard not to think there's more to it, you know." Across the aisle, a younger woman, Tasha, was filming herself on her phone. "So, guys, we're still grounded because the airline is dealing with the fallout from what happened earlier," she said, speaking directly to her followers. "I'm telling you, the guy they kicked off, Samuel Bryant, was nothing but nice the whole time. The way he was treated was so unfair. I can't believe it." Michelle, still stationed in the galley, could feel the weight of the passengers' judgment without even hearing their words. The whispers, the glances, they all carried the same unspoken accusation. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her nerves. This was spiraling out of control faster than she had ever imagined. Her mind replayed the earlier moments in an endless loop. Each time she went over the interaction with Samuel, she tried to justify her actions to herself. He hadn't outright broken any rules, but something about him had unsettled her. Was it his confidence, the attention he garnered from other passengers, or was it something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to confront? The airline's corporate team had also sprung into action. In a conference room at their headquarters, executives were gathered around a large screen displaying the viral videos. The footage was damning, showing Samuel's calm and respectful demeanor, contrasted sharply with Michelle's increasingly hostile tone. One executive, a man in a sharp navy suit, rubbed his temples. "This is a PR nightmare," he muttered. "We need to act fast." Another executive, a woman with a sharp gaze, nodded. "We need a statement acknowledging the incident and assuring the public we're investigating it thoroughly. And we need to speak with Mr. Bryant directly. If he takes this to the media, it could get worse." As they discussed strategies, the airline's social media team was already working overtime, responding to an avalanche of comments. Words like racist, unfair, and bias were flooding their mentions. Many demanded accountability, while others called for a boycott. The pressure was mounting. Back in the terminal, Samuel had taken a seat near a window, his phone still buzzing with messages and notifications. He scrolled through them quietly, taking in the flood of support from strangers. It was heartening, but it also added to the weight he felt. People weren't just upset about what had happened to him. They were using his experience to highlight a larger pattern of unfair treatment and systemic bias. As he sat there, a young woman approached him cautiously. "Excuse me, Mr. Bryant," she said softly. Samuel looked up, offering her a kind smile. "Yes." She hesitated, glancing around nervously. I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything. A lot of people would have lost their temper, but you stayed calm. It meant a lot to see that." Samuel's smile deepened. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "But I think it's the people who spoke up on the plane who deserve the thanks. They didn't have to, but they chose to do what was right." The woman nodded, looking relieved. "Well, I just wanted you to know that we're behind you. Whatever happens next, we've got your back." As she walked away, Samuel's thoughts turned to the broader implications of what had happened. He wasn't naive. He understood that incidents like this weren't rare, especially for people who looked like him. His wealth and status had shielded him from some forms of prejudice, but today's events were a stark reminder that no one was truly immune. Meanwhile, Michelle's internal struggle was reaching a breaking point. She paced the galley, her thoughts racing. Her supervisor's warnings echoed in her mind, but it was the passengers' reactions that truly haunted her. She had spent years building her career, priding herself on her professionalism, but now she was questioning everything. Had she let her biases cloud her judgment? Had she let personal feelings influence her actions? Before she could dwell on it further, the airline representative returned to the plane, accompanied by another official. They approached Michelle quietly. Passengers watched as Michelle was led off the plane, their curiosity and unease growing. The whispers started again, this time louder, as speculation swirled about what her removal could mean. As the flight remained delayed, Samuel received another call, this time from a high-ranking airline executive. The voice on the other end was calm and measured, but Samuel could sense the urgency behind the words. "Mr. Bryant, we'd like to formally apologize for what happened today. We're committed to addressing this issue and ensuring it doesn't happen again." Samuel listened quietly, letting the executive speak. When they finished, he responded with the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the ordeal. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about me. This is about making sure no one else has to experience something like this. What steps is the airline taking to address that?" The executive hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. "We're conducting a thorough review," they said finally, "and we'd like to work with you to ensure we're taking the right steps." Samuel nodded to himself. "I'll consider it," he said simply. "For now, I think it's important that this conversation continues." As he ended the call, he looked out at the runway, his reflection visible in the glass. The tension in the air was far from resolved, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a single flight anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. Samuel sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon as he processed the whirlwind of events. Despite his calm demeanor, the weight of what had happened was beginning to settle in. The looks, the whispers, the subtle but unmistakable dismissal of his dignity, they all cut deeper than he let on. He had spent his life proving himself, breaking barriers, and earning respect in rooms where people like him were often overlooked. And yet, here he was, singled out and humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers for no discernible reason. Inside the plane, the atmosphere had grown tense. Michelle had not yet returned, and the passengers were left in an awkward limbo. A few whispered among themselves, debating what might happen next. Others kept refreshing their social media feeds, watching as the story unfolded in real time. One of the passengers, a man named Jordan, decided he couldn't sit in silence any longer. He stood up, addressing the flight attendant who had taken Michelle's place. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What's the holdup? We've been sitting here for over an hour, and it's clear something's going on." The substitute flight attendant, a younger woman who seemed uncomfortable with the situation, hesitated before responding. "We're just waiting for clearance from the airline," she said, trying to sound professional. "We'll be taking off shortly." Jordan didn't seem satisfied. "Is this about what happened earlier? Because if it is, I think everyone on this plane deserves to know what's going on." Several passengers murmured their agreement. The tension was no longer contained. It was spilling over into open frustration. The substitute flight attendant gave a tight-lipped smile and retreated to the galley, clearly overwhelmed. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Samuel noticed that more and more travelers were stopping to look at him. Some approached cautiously, offering words of support, while others merely stared, their curiosity piqued by the viral story. A part of him wanted to leave, to find a quieter space where he could think without the constant interruptions. But he knew that staying visible was important. The public attention wasn't just about him anymore, it was about shining a light on something much bigger. As he sat there, a man in a dark suit approached him. The man introduced himself as a senior executive from the airline's corporate office. "Mr. Bryant," he said, extending a hand. "I want to personally apologize for what happened. This situation is unacceptable, and I assure you are taking it very seriously." Samuel shook the man's hand, but didn't immediately respond. He studied the executive carefully, noting the nervous energy behind his polished exterior. "Taking it seriously?" Samuel said finally. "What does that mean exactly?" The executive hesitated, then gestured toward a nearby seating area. "May I sit?" he asked. When Samuel nodded, the man continued. "We've spoken with the flight attendant involved and are conducting a full investigation. In the meantime, we'd like to offer you compensation for the inconvenience and ensure your next flight is as comfortable as possible." Samuel leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "With all due respect," he said, his voice steady, "this isn't about compensation or comfort. It's about accountability. I don't want this swept under the rug as a misunderstanding. People deserve better." The executive nodded, his discomfort evident. "We understand that, and we're committed to making changes. This incident doesn't reflect our values as a company." Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "Then prove it." Inside the plane, the unease was reaching a boiling point. Passengers were no longer content to sit quietly. A woman in her 30s, seated in the middle of the cabin, stood up and turned to address the rest of the passengers. "Can we talk about what happened earlier?" she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I saw everything, and I think we all know that man didn't deserve to be kicked off this flight." Her words were met with a ripple of agreement. Others began chiming in, sharing their observations and frustrations. "He was polite the whole time," one man said. "That flight attendant was out of line." "She kept picking on him," another passenger added. "It was obvious." The murmurs grew louder, blending into a collective voice of discontent. The substitute flight attendant returned to the front of the cabin, her face pale as she tried to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We'll be departing soon." But the passengers weren't placated. The woman who had started the conversation turned back to the others. "We need to say something," she said. "If we stay quiet, nothing will change." In the terminal, Samuel's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from his attorney. "Samuel," the attorney began, skipping formalities, "this situation is escalating fast. Have you seen the latest videos?" "I've seen some," Samuel replied. "Why?" "There are more angles now," the attorney said. "Passengers recorded everything, and it's clear you didn't do anything wrong. The airline knows they're in trouble, which is why they're scrambling to fix this. You have leverage, but we need to decide how to use it." Samuel frowned, considering his options. He wasn't interested in creating a spectacle, but he also couldn't ignore the broader implications of what had happened. "Let's see how they handle it," he said finally. "I want to give them a chance to do the right thing." His attorney sighed. "Just be careful. They might try to shift the narrative if they think it'll protect their image." As Samuel ended the call, he noticed a growing crowd near the gate. It wasn't just passengers from his flight. Other travelers were gathering, drawn by the buzz surrounding the incident. A few reporters had even arrived, their cameras and microphones at the ready. Back on the plane, Michelle had returned, her face pale but composed. She walked down the aisle with the substitute flight attendant, avoiding eye contact with the passengers. Whispers followed her every step, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. The woman who had spoken up earlier watched Michelle closely, her expression a mix of anger and determination. As Michelle reached the galley, the woman stood again. "Excuse me," she said loudly, addressing Michelle directly. "Do you have anything to say about what happened earlier?" Michelle froze, caught off guard by the direct question. For a moment, she looked as though she might respond, but then she shook her head and disappeared into the galley. The passengers exchanged glances, their dissatisfaction growing. The substitute flight attendant tried to restore order, but it was clear the situation was spiraling out of control. The passengers' voices grew louder, their frustration turning into outright demands for answers. And outside, the scene at the gate was becoming just as chaotic, with reporters pressing airline representatives for a statement. As the tension reached its peak, Samuel remained seated near the window, watching the growing storm around him. He knew the moment of truth was approaching, and he was ready to face it head-on. As Samuel observed the commotion from his seat near the gate, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The message contained a link and a brief note. "You need to see this before they try to bury it." Asterisk. Curious but cautious, Samuel clicked the link. It led to a video, a security camera recording from inside the terminal, time-stamped from earlier that day. The footage showed Michelle before the boarding process began. She was standing with two other airline staff members, talking animatedly. The audio was muffled, but her expression was unmistakable, a sharp glare and a smirk that seemed to radiate disdain. She gestured in the direction of the gate, and while the words weren't clear, one phrase stood out when she pointed toward where Samuel had been seated. "People like that always think they're above the rules." Samuel's stomach dropped as he replayed the clip. It was a blatant confirmation that Michelle's actions weren't just random enforcement of policies, they were personal. Outside, the scene at the gate was escalating quickly. Reporters were now openly questioning passengers who had left the plane, recording first-hand accounts of what they'd witnessed. The airline's representatives were visibly overwhelmed, their attempts to downplay the incident only fueling more curiosity. Inside the plane, the atmosphere remained heavy with tension. Michelle hadn't emerged from the galley since she'd returned, and the substitute flight attendant was doing her best to maintain calm. But the passengers weren't satisfied. One man stood up, addressing the group. "I've had enough of this," he said. "If they're not going to handle this properly, we should all just leave. Maybe that'll make them listen." Several others nodded in agreement. It was a bold suggestion, but the frustration in the cabin had reached a breaking point. People were tired of being kept in the dark and treated as though their voices didn't matter. Meanwhile, Samuel's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a reporter who had somehow obtained his number. He let it ring for a moment, debating whether to answer. Finally, he picked up, his voice calm but firm. "This is Samuel Bryant." "Mr. Bryant," the reporter began, her tone eager but respectful. "This is Leah Torres with the Globe *. We've been following the situation closely, and I wanted to get your side of the story. We've also just received footage that could change everything." Samuel's pulse quickened. "Footage?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. "Yes," Leah said. "It's from earlier in the terminal. It seems to suggest that the flight attendant's actions may have been motivated by bias. Have you seen it?" "I have," Samuel replied after a moment. "But this isn't just about me. It's about holding people accountable and ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." Leah paused, her voice softening. "I understand. But you should know, the video is already circulating online. The story is gaining momentum, and people are demanding answers. This could be much bigger than anyone anticipated." Samuel thanked her and ended the call. His mind raced as he considered his next steps. The stakes had shifted. What had started as a personal injustice was now a full-blown controversy, with far-reaching implications for the airline and beyond. Back on the plane, Michelle sat in the galley, her head in her hands. She'd seen the writing on the wall as soon as she returned from her meeting with the airline representatives. They hadn't explicitly said it, but she knew she was being set up as a scapegoat. The video from the terminal was the final nail in the coffin. It wouldn't matter if she tried to explain herself. Her career was hanging by a thread. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions truly sink in. She'd made snap judgments, let her emotions dictate her decisions, and now everything was unraveling. But as much as she wanted to retreat into denial, she couldn't ignore the truth. She'd made a mistake, and it was costing her dearly. Outside, the passengers' frustrations boiled over. A group of them decided to disembark, voicing their dissatisfaction loudly as they filed off the plane. One woman, still filming on her phone, turned to the camera and said, "We're not just going to sit here and let them sweep this under the rug. This isn't right." As Samuel watched the passengers exit, he felt a surge of gratitude. These strangers didn't owe him anything, yet they were standing up for what they believed was right. Their solidarity gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Suddenly, a commotion near the gate drew his attention. A man in a suit, clearly an airline executive, was being confronted by reporters. One of them thrust a microphone toward him, demanding, "What does the airline have to say about the allegations of discrimination? And what about the videos circulating online?" The executive looked visibly flustered, but attempted to maintain his composure. "We are taking these allegations very seriously," he said. "Our team is conducting a thorough investigation, and we are committed to ensuring that all our passengers are treated with respect and fairness." The reporters weren't satisfied with the canned response. Another journalist pressed him further. "Does that include addressing the actions of the flight attendant involved? And what steps are being taken to prevent incidents like this in the future?" The executive stammered, his carefully crafted facade starting to crack. Before he could respond, another wave of passengers emerged from the plane, their voices adding to the growing chaos. The story was no longer contained. It had erupted into a full-blown crisis. And just as the tension seemed unbearable, Samuel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from a major news outlet. The headline read, "Billionaire kicked off Flight Sparks outrage. New video raises questions of discrimination." As Samuel read the article, his heart sank. The situation had taken on a life of its own, and there was no telling how it would unfold. But one thing was clear: the world was watching, and the truth was finally coming to light. Samuel stood from his seat near the terminal window, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The chatter around him, the reporters scrambling for statements, the passengers who had chosen to leave the plane, all of it pointed to one undeniable truth: this situation had reached a tipping point. He glanced down at his phone, where the security footage from earlier in the terminal still played on repeat in his mind. It was damning, yes, but it also felt like a piece of a larger puzzle. Something about it nagged at him, a detail just out of reach. Before he could dwell on it further, the airline executive approached him again, this time flanked by another senior representative and a public relations officer. Their expressions were grim but determined. "Mr. Bryant," the executive began, his tone more measured than before, "we've reviewed the additional footage, and we want to extend our sincerest apologies for what occurred. We deeply regret the treatment you experienced and are committed to making this right." Samuel crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "And what does making it right mean?" he asked, his voice calm but unyielding. "A public apology, compensation, those are easy fixes. What about accountability?" The PR officer stepped forward. "We're prepared to issue a formal statement acknowledging the mistakes made and outlining the actions we'll be taking, including mandatory bias training for all staff and a thorough review of our policies." Samuel nodded slightly, but his expression didn't soften. "And the flight attendant?" The executive hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "The flight attendant in question has been temporarily relieved of her duties while we complete the investigation. We assure you, Mr. Bryant, that we take this matter very seriously." Before Samuel could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the gate. Reporters had turned their cameras toward Michelle, who had emerged from the plane looking pale and frazzled. She was flanked by two other airline employees who seemed to be escorting her toward the terminal exit. As she passed by, the questions came fast and loud. "Do you have anything to say about the incident? Do you believe your actions were justified? Are you aware of the video that's been circulating?" Michelle kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, but just as she neared the terminal doors, she stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost deafening as everyone waited to see what she would do. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Samuel. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, a mix of tension, regret, and something else Samuel couldn't quite place. Then, to everyone's surprise, Michelle stepped forward, breaking away from the employees at her sides. She walked towards Samuel, her movements slow and deliberate, until they were standing just a few feet apart. "I need to say something," Michelle began, her voice shaky but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I've made mistakes. Today, I let my assumptions and emotions guide my actions, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Michelle didn't stop. "Mr. Bryant," she said, her voice catching slightly, "I'm sorry. Not because the airline told me to say it, but because I know what I did was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's on me." Samuel studied her carefully, searching her face for sincerity. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the vulnerability in her posture. It was clear that whatever had driven her actions earlier, she now understood the consequences. After a long pause, he spoke. "Acknowledging it is a start," he said, his tone steady. "But words without action don't mean much." Michelle nodded, her face tight with emotion. "I know," she said quietly. "I'll accept whatever consequences come my way. I just wanted you to hear it from me." As she walked away, the crowd remained silent, stunned by the unexpected turn of events. Samuel stood still for a moment, processing what had just happened. He didn't feel vindicated or triumphant, just wary. But there was something about Michelle's apology that struck a chord. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but it was a step toward accountability. The airline executive cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Mr. Bryant," he said, his voice tentative, "we'd like to invite you to reboard the plane if you're willing. We've made arrangements to ensure the rest of your journey is as smooth as possible." Samuel looked past the executive toward the gate, where a small group of passengers still lingered, watching him intently. They had been his allies, speaking up when it mattered most. Without them, this moment wouldn't have been possible. "I'll reboard," Samuel said finally, "but only if the other passengers who left are invited back as well. They stood up for what was right, and they deserve to complete their journey without penalty." The executive hesitated, clearly unprepared for the request, but the PR officer stepped in, nodding quickly. "Of course, we'll make the arrangements immediately." As Samuel and the other passengers returned to the plane, the tension in the cabin had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with frustration and uncertainty, but filled with a quiet sense of solidarity. The passengers greeted Samuel with small nods and smiles that earlier anger now replaced with respect. But just as the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Samuel's phone buzzed one final time. It was a message from the same unknown number that had sent the security footage. This time it read, "Asterisk, you've done your part. Now it's my turn." Asterisk, attached was a short video, this one showing Michelle in a different light. She was speaking passionately to a group of fellow employees, describing her experiences with workplace stress and the pressure of maintaining authority in high-stakes situations. Her words revealed a deeper layer of vulnerability, one that hinted at the struggles she carried beneath her stern exterior. Samuel watched the video in silence, his thoughts racing. The story wasn't as simple as he'd thought. It rarely was. As the plane lifted into the sky, he leaned back in his seat, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The conflict had reached its climax, but the journey toward understanding and change was far from over. As the plane soared above the clouds, Samuel gazed out of the window, his mind racing with thoughts about the day's events. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. But more than that, there was a sense of clarity. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, and yet it had unfolded in a way that felt bigger than himself. It wasn't just about what happened to him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar situations without the platform or support to fight back. The passengers who had reboarded settled into their seats, their earlier frustration replaced by quiet conversations. A young woman in the row across from Samuel leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for standing your ground. A lot of us were inspired by how you handled everything." Samuel smiled softly, nodding in appreciation. "I couldn't have done it without all of you speaking up," he replied. "It means a lot." Throughout the flight, the atmosphere remained calm, but there was an unspoken bond among the passengers. They had witnessed something important, a moment where collective voices made a difference. Samuel felt that connection deeply, knowing it would stay with him long after the plane touched down. Meanwhile, back at the airline's corporate headquarters, the fallout from the incident was still unfolding. The security footage had been leaked to major news outlets, and Michelle's earlier comments were now the center of intense scrutiny. The airline had issued a public statement, acknowledging the bias in her actions and outlining immediate steps to address it, including enhanced training and independent oversight. The CEO even appeared in a short video, pledging to rebuild trust with passengers and ensure accountability within the organization. For Michelle, the consequences were swift. She had been placed on indefinite leave pending further review. In the days that followed, she became the subject of heated debates online. Some condemned her actions outright, calling for her termination, while others argued that her apology had shown genuine remorse and that she deserved a chance to learn and grow from the experience. Samuel, too, had become a central figure in the public discourse. His name trended across social media, with hashtags like #StandWithSamuel and #FlyFairly gaining traction. Journalists reached out for interviews, activists drew parallels to systemic issues, and countless strangers shared their own stories of injustice in solidarity. It was overwhelming, but Samuel knew that this moment carried an opportunity to create meaningful change. A few days after the flight, Samuel received a surprising email from Michelle. It was brief but heartfelt, written with the vulnerability of someone trying to make amends. She thanked him for listening to her apology and expressed a desire to understand how her actions had affected him. She also admitted that seeing herself in the leaked footage had been a wake-up call, forcing her to confront her own biases in a way she hadn't before. Samuel considered her words carefully. He knew that forgiveness wasn't something to give lightly, nor was it his alone to offer. What had happened on that plane was part of a much larger issue, one that couldn't be solved by a single apology. But he also believed in the power of accountability and the possibility of growth. He replied with a measured response, encouraging her to use this experience as a starting point for deeper reflection and action. In the weeks that followed, Samuel found himself drawn into broader conversations about systemic bias and accountability. He partnered with advocacy groups to amplify voices that often went unheard and worked with the airline to ensure their promised reforms were implemented meaningfully. It wasn't about punishing Michelle or any single person. It was about creating a culture where incidents like this wouldn't happen again. The airline, for its part, followed through on its commitments. They launched an independent review of their policies, partnered with diversity and inclusion experts, and invited passengers to participate in forums to share their experiences. It was far from perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. One afternoon, Samuel found himself at a community event hosted by one of the advocacy groups he'd begun supporting. As he spoke to a small crowd about his experience, he noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was Michelle, standing quietly near the back, listening intently. When the event ended, she approached him cautiously. "I didn't want to interrupt," she said, her voice soft. but I wanted to thank you for what you said. It gave me a lot to think about. Samuel nodded, sensing the sincerity in her words. I'm glad, he said. These conversations aren't easy, but they're necessary. They talked briefly, not about the incident itself, but about the lessons they had both taken from it. For Michelle, it was a humbling experience that forced her to confront her own blind spots. For Samuel, it was a reminder of the importance of resilience and the power of collective action. As Michelle left, Samuel reflected on how far things had come since that fateful flight. The story had started with conflict and injustice, but it had grown into something more, a catalyst for change, a moment of reckoning that had pushed people to think, speak out, and demand better. In the end, the resolution wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was messy, human, and full of hard truths. And as Samuel stepped outside into the crisp evening air, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And sometimes, all it took was one moment to spark a movement.